So let's talk a little bit about that article that I mentioned before, Ilyenkov's article, Our Schools Must Teach Children How to Think. So this is a very basic premise, and if you've ever attended any educational body, you would know that this is kind of a slogan still. We are supposed to teach children not what to think, but how to think. But unfortunately, a lot of the modern institutions fail to deliver this. And I would argue in the past, we didn't really know much about education and pedagogy just because the system of public education is relatively new. It's only been around for maybe 150 years. Before that, it was mostly religious-based education. You could go to a seminary, and this is where you would get your education. But of course, it was very, very skewed, and not everybody could afford to do that because a lot of children in peasant families, for example, they were not able to abandon their families and just go study. They needed to help their families, so they needed to work on the farm, to work on the fields together with everyone else. When they reached the age of like 7 or 8, that was very common in the past. We all know this. So public education is a recently new phenomenon. It's only been around for a century and a half. So of course we didn't know much about it before. So of course people like Ilyenkov, they're making those statements that now seem to be like run-of-the-mill cliches. And he of course did not write about this that long ago. It was in the 60s and in the 70s. However, he does also make tangible suggestions. One of the examples that he gives is mathematics. He suggests teaching abstract mathematics, algebra, like the beginning of algebra, before we teach children the concept of numbers, just because the concept of numbers is actually more abstract than such terms as more, less, or equal. He argues that it is kind of against children's intuitive way of thinking when we suggest adding random objects together and saying that, yeah, this is normal to add 2 girls and 2 sacks of grain, because these things abstractly can be qualified in the same way. So he argues that more, less, and equal are natural, and a lot of the babies and children and toddlers are seeing this in their real life. They're able to distinguish more from less, and they're able to see different substances being in equal sizes but different value. So he argues that children will come to the abstract understanding of numbers if they are first given the more concrete data to work with. And this, I think, is a very unusual but very helpful approach. I wish I was taught mathematics this way. Unfortunately, I wasn't, so I don't have a great relationship with mathematics. And Ilyenkov argues that concrete education is necessary before we go into the abstracts. He actually says that we as humans, we begin with learning about concrete objects that we're surrounded with, and we understand them by observing them empirically, by using our senses. But then he argues that before going into the abstractions like colors and what the things are used for, we let the children explore and actually come to their own conclusions before suggesting our own. And of course, he is not arguing for children to come up with science on their own. He's just saying that those first exploratory steps are necessary for appropriate development. And granted, we do utilize some of this nowadays, and it has been tried in the Soviet Union as well. It's not like a completely groundbreaking discovery that Ilyenkov made. But I do still suggest you read this article just because of the examples. He does give the Hegelian example of abstract thinking, which I discussed earlier. And he gives some more examples as well, even though this article is a little bit ranty and kind of out of style for him. Usually his style is quite different. But going back to the discussion of education generally, and as I was talking about Soviet education, I kind of made some criticisms of it, and I kind of forgot about all the great things that the Soviet education did. Obviously, it helped millions upon millions of people to become literate. The literacy rate at the time of the collapse of the USSR in the early 90s was like 98% or so. It was no less than 97% as far as I remember, which is huge because the literacy rate before in all of these territories, it was pretty much below 20% or so. In some places, I would argue even below 10%, like in Kazakhstan, barely anyone could read or write or even dare to think of science or poetry or art or anything outside immediate survival. But moreover, the Soviets also did experimental education with various types of children. For example, Grunya Sukhareva, a Soviet researcher who studied autism way back before we even knew what autism was, she was the one who suggested that people with autism were not completely incapacitated, and she actually worked with children with autism, and she helped them through introducing things very slowly and just looking at lessening the sensory load and basically doing a lot of the things that the modern special education does. And she discovered that given right circumstances, given right environments, these children could actually partake in some meaningful tasks that were entertaining to them and that were educational to them, and that ultimately they were even able to partake in some labor. And she advocated for these people's rights. So she was an advocate for disabled, unlike Asperger's, after whom until recently some types of autism were called. Asperger was a fascist researcher who used the research on people with autism to determine who was capable of work and who was not useful for the state, so therefore didn't deserve to live. Those who were capable of work were named after him, people with Asperger's syndrome. And I'm so glad that we're getting rid of this term because this person doesn't deserve to have this type of recognition. Grunya Sukhalyova, on the other hand, does, because she did not look at these children as someone to just exploit. She looked at these children as people who could be helped given the right circumstances and conditions. But unfortunately nowadays she's not very well known, so I do encourage you to look her up because I think she did some amazing discoveries in this area. Other experiments in education that I've read about when I was younger were when in some certain schools they got rid of grades to see if children would be incentivized naturally, intrinsically, and it kind of worked. Unfortunately, those projects didn't persist. I wish they did, because this is amazing and this is something that I really certainly needed when I was growing up. Other experiments included exploring all types of integration of practical knowledge into mental or cognitive type of knowledge, where children would work on projects. They would study certain subject matter first on paper, they would read about it, they would look at pictures, but then they would go into the world and explore this actual thing. For example, ducks. They would study everything about ducks and then go help on the farm to raise ducks, to feed them, to see their life processes, etc. So there were a few of these schools. Unfortunately, again, they didn't persist. There are probably many reasons why. I didn't really look into the reasons why many of these type of experimental schools closed. It is amazing to see such experiments happen, and it is amazing to see the result of them, and I wish we integrated more of that knowledge into the modern education. Of course, modern education needs a complete paradigm shift. We have to incorporate all types of education, practical education, anything that's actually applicable to a real world life. But it doesn't mean that we should just learn how to calculate our taxes or do some woodwork or do some sewing. Of course, these are necessary and should be encouraged to be included, but things like dialectics, philosophy, art, the history of art, and all kinds of applicable arts where you get to actually do it, dance, music of all different types, all of this should be much more incorporated into modern education, and we should have people who really are passionate about teaching these subjects. Then we're going to see a very different result. Not the kind of things we're seeing today where children are very much disengaged and very apathetic and they don't really see the need for such education. So this is just a little addition to that video I made last week about Ilyenkov's article. Please read it yourself. It's a pretty short read. It's not going to take too much time. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Do take care of yourself and your communities first. Let me know what you think, and I hope you have a great day today, and I'll talk to you sometime later.